It's One Nation Restorations, and we're restoring another American-made tool with American-made tools. This 1950s pair of tinner snips is in need of a full restoration. The rust has taken over this piece, and you can barely see the remnants of the iconic bluebird color that was forged in the USA by Bergman Tool Manufacturing Company. The shape of this patented tinner snip was created for a circular cut, but as dull as this blade is, you're not cutting anything with them. The plan for this restoration is to sharpen the blades, de-rust the handles, take out all the pits, polish the neck and tips, and get these painted with that blue color that made it so recognizable in your grandfather's toolbox, which is exactly where this pair came from. In doing this restoration, I cannot tell you how much I appreciated the design of the pivot bolt. It has a squared end that fits perfectly into the snips, which prevents it from unscrewing itself during use. That's a common problem with older tinner snips and scissors that requires you to flare out the bolt once it's installed by striking the end with a hammer. The bulk of the time spent restoring this piece is going to be on polishing the tips. Before I start that, it's off to the de-rusting solution to soak overnight. Evaporust will get you about 8 to 10 projects per gallon before you need to switch it out. It loses strength over time, but you can help by taking off any surface rust before you get them to soak. I buy gallons from the local hardware store, and you can get a 5-gallon bucket from Summit Racing. The 5-gallon buckets are basically a gallon free at bulk price, so it depends on how often you use it. After the soak, I used a 2000 grit sandpaper to see how it did. You don't want to use anything aggressive here just in case it only needs light work. You never know what's underneath a mess of rust, and sometimes I've been able to get away with going straight to the buffing wheel, but that's not the case here. I back down to 150 grit to take away any of the remaining paint. Before you do that, make sure to measure out the paint line so you can tape it off in the right spot for after the restoration and before the paint. To get inside the stamping, I used an American-made abrasive stone that I picked up from HarryEpstein.com, which sells old and new American tools that are sometimes hard to find. Now, I love the old casting look that came from the American workers forging these by hands, but I'm not going to take out any of these imperfections. Now, if that's something that you want to do, it's relatively easy to do with a little extra time and effort. Hit it with a file, sand down the high spots, and follow behind it with those sanding stones. We said before that this piece is going to go down to the polished look. Now, if you have a tool that you want to do this with, you have to understand that this does not take any real technical skill. It's all about having patience and taking out the scratches. You can cut your time way down by using a sanding belt, but you also have to be careful not to take out any of the curves from a piece like this. I started with a 40 grit sandpaper, and the reason these tinner snips need 40 grit is because of all the pits that they have from being used and dropped over the last 70 years. The lower the grit size, the coarser the abrasive, and the easier it is to remove material. In order to get these pits out, you have to sand down the metal to the lowest point of the deepest pit. After you finish getting all the pits, stop sanding with the 40 grit and move up to the 60. The 40 is going to leave its own grooves and marks in the metal because it's sandpaper. So the goal of the 60 grit is to remove the 40 grit's grooves. So take the grooves down with a 60 grit all the way down till those grooves are gone, and now bump up to the 80, and the 80 is going to take down the 60 grit's grooves. And so on. You do this process from 80 to 120, 120 up to 180 to 220 to 320, and continue all the way up. The pro tip here is to sand at 90 degrees difference from each of the grits. The reason you want to do this because the marks for the 40, you make them horizontal, and then when you come in with a vertical mark for the 60, it's easier to see the horizontals. They're unmistakable. So basically, sand until there's no more horizontal marks and then move up to the 80. And now the only thing you have are vertical, so with the 80, sand horizontal. And so you'll sand until all the vertical marks are gone and then bump up to the 120. You repeat this process, and it's way easier to see when it's time to move up to the next stage. This piece didn't have enough space to do the 90-degree grooves, so I had to spend extra time at each of the spots to pay extra attention to the depths of the grooves. Once you finally hit the 320 grit, I like to switch over to the 320 wet sand. This is only done if you want a super smooth or mirror finish. For the Buckingham Thread Restore, I stopped at 220 grit, which is considered super fine grit anyways. This is also where I stop for wood projects too. Wet sanding uses the water as a lubricant. Imagine washing your car without water. The dirt itself is going to act as an abrasive and scratch your car. Instead, you use soap, which puts a lubricant between your car paint and the dirt particles to prevent the scratching. Well, that's exactly what the water's doing here with the wet sanding for your polished tool. For this project, I went from 400 to 800, 800 to 1500 to 2000 to 2500. I ran out of the 1000 grit, so I had to spend some extra time at the 1500, which really cost me because jumping from 800 to 1500 is a big jump. You're going to be applying a decent amount of pressure for hours, and in my case, 7 for this tool. That would explain the Band-Aids that I'm wearing. I put those on for extra padding on my fingers, and even though I'm wearing those to prevent blisters, I'm still sore to the touch. Once you get down to the 2500 grit, you have to remember you're still hitting metal with sandpaper. Sandpaper leaves scratches that have to be buffed out. I use a 3-pad process, firm, medium, and hard. When you go to the hardware store to buy them, they've already got them labeled for you. Each one will require their own specific buffing compound. I use the American-made compound Dyco, and they label their packages with which compound goes with which firmness pad. Once you hit a pad with a compound, never switch to a different one. You can't cross-contaminate your buffing wheels. The firm one will take out the scratches from the 2500 sandpaper. The medium one will take it to a good shine, and the soft one will polish it to a mirror finish. All that sanding and polishing took an already dull blade and made it as smooth as the back of a butter knife. I have some vintage new old stock American-made files that are used for sharpening saw blades. That makes them perfect for sharpening scissors and snips. I used brake parts cleaner to remove the residue from the buffing compound so I could put tape on the tip. This serves as a way to protect the mirrored finish and act as a guide for the file. It will obviously go right through the tape, so be careful sharpening the blade. When you apply the file, use one long continuous stroke to keep the blade even, and also try to avoid falling off the end so you don't round it off. If you found this sharpening tip helpful or any others in this video, click the subscribe button for more restoration tips to help you with your projects. After getting the tape applied to the polishing tips, I poked a hole through it where the pivot bolt goes because it's an easy place to hang the scissors from. It's ready to head to the painting area for a coat of primer, and I'm using one that can be sanded to remove any of the small imperfections that the grinding stone missed. This will leave the handle's coat of paint looking as smooth as the polished tips. I used a 220 grit sandpaper to knock down any of the high spots, and now it's ready for paint. The color that I went with is a patriotic blue, which was the closest that I could find to the Bluebird's original color. This piece is no longer in the rusted and dull state that it was. The polished tip and iconic Bluebird handle has been brought back to life. The time spent was well worth it now that you can finally imagine this tool next to your new Malco Eagle grips in your toolbox. Keep your eye out for an unboxing video on those American-made tools soon. It's now time for reassembly. The rounded part of the bolt goes through the round hole first, and then place the square hole over the pivot bolt and attach the nut to the end. Tighten it enough to take the play out of the blades, but not so tight that it won't open and close smoothly. This is also your chance to finally remove the burr that was created from the file. You don't have to do anything special. It'll come off on its own when you close the snips for the first time. The last move is to add some wax or some oil to prevent rusting. You didn't work this hard just to have it rust out on you again. This is some 24 gauge aluminum that I used to test and check the sharpness of the blade. If you don't get the cut that you want, head back to your vise and file it some more. This project took 9 hours to complete. The longest part of the project was the 7 hours that it took to sand and polish this thing. My favorite part of this project was putting the sharp edge back on this tinner snips for the first time in who knows how long. I was so inspired by the way this piece turned out, I went out and bought more to add to my collection. I even found 3 new old stock snips that are still in their original boxes that are going to be shipped out next week. I'm excited to compare the paint matchups and how the polished look is going to stack up to how they came from the factory 70 years ago. Be sure to click another one of our videos for more restoration tips. We restored another American-made tool with American-made tools. See you next time.